Greetings, one and all, to the most cursed, most cringiest corner of the internet. A YouTube channel content creator actively alienating everyone in both the analog and digital worlds. Well, welcome, good evening, wonderful dice of all alignments. I am Lunar D8, and I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to give a suggestion for an idea that I think would be kind of cool. What if we had a crossover with, Fate Apocrypha and Baki the Grappler and Fairy Tale? Pretty cool. Also, I'm going to read some of a book. I have a book called Orc Eroica, Volume 2. I actually posted this video. I posted a video about that I bought it, in about a month ago, I think. It's in the I Bought Something playlist. But, so you can see the title page of the book and everything. But I talked a little bit about the book and briefly looked through it, but I didn't actually read any of it. We're going to read this novel right now. It's a whole fucking novel. It's not a very long novel, and it's got pictures in it, which, I'll be honest, there's a warning on this saying parental advisory, warning explicit content. It was wrapped in plastic when I bought it. There were no hentai pictures in it at all. This is about as lewd as you really get. But it does look like it's a very good story. So we're going to read Orc Eroica, The Conjecture Chronicles, Volume 2. The back of it says, Desperate times for Elven brides. Having struck out with the knight Judith in human lands, Bash's quest to lose his virginity leads him to the forest of elves. Bash is an orc, by the way. There he learns that the ravages of war have claimed the lives of many elven men, making interracial marriage more popular than ever. While looking for an opportunity to charm the pants off a local beauty, fortune practically falls into Bash's lap when he hears about a zombie infestation. Perfect. All he has to do is rack up some impressive body count, use the reward money to buy a special necklace, and propose to the apple of his eye. There's just one problem. The zombies are undead orcs. Then we have some really lovely full-color spreads in this, which, again, I talk a little bit about in the I Bought Something playlist. And then there's Thunder Sonia, which is the very, very sexy elf woman who I am enjoying the art for. But yeah, her little quotation up here is, I wish that just once one of them would throw caution in the wind and at least try to date me. I'd wait on him hand and foot for the rest of his days. Thunder Sonia, an archmage and elf hero who has lived for over 1,200 years. She's looking for a husband, but due to her high status and some unsavory personal rumors, she's permanently single. Then there's a dude named... Nope, that's a different person. Dude's name, Acontium? I can't say your name, sir. Anyway, his quote is, I'll have you know, there's already someone I've set my heart upon. And his little information is an elf army official acting as Thunder Sonia's personal guard. He is also involved in international affairs, through which he met the woman he plans to marry. Then there's Azalea, which is probably the woman he plans to marry, I assume. Her quotation is, good for you, Mr. Orc. I hope you find yourself someone nice, just like I found my darling hubby. Nope, she's already married. Okay. Azalea. During the war, her ruthless martial ability caused her to be feared by the succubus army. There's a succubus army? Today she enjoys life as one of the most decorated soldiers in the Elf Kingdom. Since taking a lover, she has learned to find pleasure in life beyond the battlefield. And now there's a picture of the Thunder Sonia taking a bath, which, as lewd as that sounds, there is no nudity here. You can't see anything. But she has got a quotation. The beastkin preparation is better for deodorizing. But then again, this one is Fairy Maid, and all the advertisements say Fairy Maid is the best. Ooh, more stuff. Here's one of the fight scenes where they're fighting the zombies. Bash, I'll help you. This fight belongs to the elves, after all, and this way it'll be 2 versus 2. A fair fight. I accept your assistance. Great! The two of us together will be unstoppable. Okay. Kind of an odd texture for this page. Alright, and there's a thing. Suntaku, conjecture, surmise. To make an assumption or guess about the feelings of another, and to then demonstrate care or consideration for the other party based on this. Source, Wikipedia Japan. Book 2, The Shiwanashi Forest Saga, Elf Country, Orc Eroica. The Shiwanashi Forest. The Shiwanashi Forest is located southwest of the city of Crassel, on the other side of Orc Country, which was sandwiched between them, save for the giant tree that had given the forest its name. There was nothing too remarkable about it, but to Bash, the entire forest was bursting with memories. During the war, the Shiwanashi Forest had been the site of many a pitched, bloody battle. This land, which was the dominion of one of the finest orc clans, was the orcs' last line of defense when it came to protecting their homeland. Should this area have fallen into enemy hands, the orcs would have lost their ability to coordinate and correspond with their fairy allies to the north. Knowing this, the elves attacked this region relentlessly, but they were no match for the combination of the orc and fairy forces. Move my cursor over here. Bash himself had fought battles in this forest on many occasions. During the war, he had become accustomed to every tree and root, and could probably have made his way through the blindfolded by now, even now. Thanks largely to Bash's efforts, the orcs had been able to hold the forest to the end of the war, but this victory had not been without considerable sacrifice. The chief of the Shiwanashi Forest clan was killed, and almost every single stronghold had been burned to the ground. But the forest remained in orc hands to the very end. If it had been taken, the orcs and the fairies might have been unable to hold out until the end of the war. It could have spelled annihilation for both races. But war is always cruel, and particularly so to the losers. After the hostilities had finally ceased, the orcs had to stand by and watch as the forest they had shed so much blood to protect was handed over to the elves. To add insult to injury, over 60% of the orcish woodland became the dominion of the elves as well. Another 20% was taken by the humans, leaving the orcs with a mere 20% of their own land to eke out a living upon. As an added bit of cruel irony, the remaining land actually did prove to be enough for the orcs, since many of the 30 clans' number had been decimated by the fighting. The old stomping grounds, it feels like no time has passed at all. I know what you mean, boss. Bash took a large stride forward, heading for the occupied territory of the old orcish forest. Essentially, traveling along this route meant returning, even briefly, to the old orc country. But it couldn't be helped. Bash's destination lay beyond. Boss, I knew I recognized this spot. This is where you holed up when you were injured, remember? Zell pointed to the opening of a cave. It was more of a hole, really. The sort of place that would be perfect for hibernating bear to curl up for the winter. Bash had crawled inside to conceal himself from the enemy view, while he recovered from a grievous injury sustained in battle. How could I forget? If you hadn't come along, that would have been the end for me. Dah, come on, boss. A little scratch like that wouldn't have killed you. You're made of sterner stuff. But it had been winter at the time, and a bear had indeed been inside the hole. Yet, despite his injuries, Bash had no trouble swiftly killing the bear. Its meat provided him vital sustenance, and its pelt kept him warm as he recovered. By smearing himself at the beast's waist, he was able to completely mask his scent, keeping himself safe from trackers. The elves passed him by, mistaking Bash's stench and slightly exposed furry back for that of a common bear. But Bash had indeed been grievously injured, and he had lost a lot of blood. Even worse, he lost track of Zell during the fighting and was completely alone. Death would have come for him eventually if he had remained in that state. If his loyal friend Zell hadn't searched every nook and cranny of the forest for him, eventually discovering him in the hole, then the tale of the orc hero Bash would have come to a premature conclusion. Shouldn't be too much further now, Bash muttered under his breath, as he pushed aside several branches. He could already see the glittering river up ahead. It was about 65 feet across. I'm going to turn the music off. With fast-flowing waters. The unmet river marked the border between the human and elf countries. Once they reached the other side, they would be in Shiwanashi Forest, proper dominion of the elves. The river flowed north, where it joined up with the Barg River tributary. Everything between the Unmet River and the Barg River was residual orc territory. In we go. Without hesitation, Bash stepped foot into the swirling river water. Here the Unmet River was filled with sandbars, and the water was shallow enough in places for travelers to walk across. During the war, this crossing spot had been an orcish secret, but no longer. Lizardmen topographers had canvassed the land after the war, mapped out the entire river network, and published the maps for purchase by anyone who cared to buy one. Still, the way down to this part of the river was tricky and known to few. Bash, of course, was one of the few. The orc began splashing and tromping his way through the shallows in pursuit of the opposite bank when, "Huh? Boss, you're really crossing here?" Zell's question gave the orc pause. "What's wrong crossing here?" "I mean, there's nothing wrong with it exactly." In this post-war era, each country was striving to get ahead after centuries of crippling conflict. There was no longer any animosity between countries, and none would even think to invade another. The elf race was no exception. Sure, there had been some bruised egos and harsh feelings toward the orcs immediately after the cessation of hostilities, but once it became clear the orcs would not put up any further retaliation, the elves abandoned the practice of strictly patrolling their borders altogether. Well, perhaps altogether isn't quite accurate. Even now the elves kept an eye on things, just to make sure no rogue orcs were attempting to enter their land. The unmet river served as a natural border between the orcs and the humans. The humans and the elves had long been friendly, and both were blessed with rich and prosperous lands. They hardly bothered monitoring the human border, focusing their guard on the orcs instead. Bash and Zell would be able to enter Shinwa's forts undetected through, though, probably. We have to enter it by the front gate. We can't just sneak in from the side entrance. It will be the height of bad manners. Are you sure? Sure, I'm sure. Despite how lightly manned the elf border was, it was still a border. And even now, the elves preferred to know when orcs entered the country. And why would someone circumnavigate such a border anyway, unless they were seeking to enter the elf lands? Maybe it's just really, really far to walk to the front gate. Nefarious. I see. Then what should we do? During the course of his life, Bash had never really entered a place by its proper entrance. The custom was unfamiliar to him. He had taken the hidden paths, the animal trails, the sneaky backdoor routes. His attempts to cross the river and avoid detection were pure muscle memory left over from a lifetime of war. If we head south a little, there's a bridge, see? We can use that to cross. Whatever you say. Bash nodded and changed direction, heading downriver. If Zell said so, then it must be the right thing to do. Wow, this place sure has changed, hasn't it? After walking in silence for a while, Zell piped up again. Bash lifted his head and looked around. The thick canopy of dark green trees, the clear, fast-running river, the sound of trickling water and rustling foliage. It was a fine spot, the perfect place for a bit of fishing, followed by an afternoon nap on the shore. It changed, all right. The unmet river, Bash knew, had been nothing like this. The river had been dammed up during the wartime to keep the lizardmen reinforcements at bay, and the river itself was less than half as wide as it was now. The area around the dam had been seen much fighting, and the water that flowed from that point had been dark and brackish, with mud and blood, bodies floating along at regular intervals. The surrounding trees had been all but burned and destroyed by the ravages of war, leaving blackened husks. The smoky, suffocating air had been filled with the roaring, orcish war cries, the chanting of elven spells, and the blooming of explosives, and the clanging of steel against steel. The gentle sounds of the forest, the trickling river, had been completely drowned out by the din. It has changed, but it's simply gone back to how it always meant to be. Ah, how poetic you are all of a sudden, boss. But you're completely right. The forest was always meant to be peaceful and soothing like this. It is precisely as it should be. Thick trees with rustling green foliage, pristine rivers of sparkling water, beautiful flowery meadows with the sun shining down from the heavens. Flitting and zooming around a forest like this makes me feel so at peace. You sounded almost like a typical fairy just now, Zell. Eck! No, boss. I am no ordinary fairy. I am an outlier among fairies, a pioneer of my race, the shiniest and brightest example of a fairy to ever be found in all of fairy kind. I put the fair in fairy. I put the flare in flare. Well, never mind that. Although, I suppose I'm only here because I got bored of the Fey life. Snuff, Well, while Zell was babbling, Bash sniffed the air. That's supposed to be a sniffing sound? Okay. A curious scent had entered his nostrils. It was the smell of meat. I'm hungry, but not ordinary meat. No, this scent was familiar to Bash, and quite unpleasant at that. It was the scent of rotting flesh. Meat so rotten as to be completely inedible, an affront to the senses. All orcs have strong stomachs and can can digest rotten carrion from time to time when there is no alternative. But there is one type of meat that orcs never eat: the meat of sentient beings. I feel like the orcs in the Lord of the Rings are not quite so civilized. This includes orc flesh, of course, as orcs are not cannibals. About that, well, at least this fictional world here is much more kindly. But it also extends to other sentient races of the world, because orcs are civilized individuals. Even orcs have an understanding of ethics. It is true that before the war, they consumed the flesh of other races, but after fighting against them for so many years, the orcs began to think of their foes as beings worthy of respect, just as they themselves were. And then we have a quotation of ellipses. Bash cast his gaze across the river breadth, where something could be seen squirming on the far shore. It was an amalgamation of flesh that was mostly brown and white and purple marbling. It was so necrotic that it looked like it was about to start slogging off the bone. But its shape was surprisingly well preserved. It was in the shape of a person, a mass of rotten flesh, in a humanoid form. That's a zombie. A zombie, yes. The zombie looked at Bash, a red glow flaming in its eye sockets. Then it began to shamble into the river. It was making its way straight toward Bash. For some reason, zombies abhor the living. They attack anything that draws breath in an attempt to steal away their life force. None knew why. Was it because they held a grudge against the living? Or was it because the Lord of the Dead bid them to do so? Now the zombie was homing in on Bash, compelled mindlessly by whatever forces guided it. But the current was too strong. The zombie stumbled and fell into the water before being swept off downstream. Looks like we need to watch out for zombies in this area. So it would seem. After the war and during the war, too, undead beings started popping up all over the place. Wherever battles were fought, zombies and reanimated skeletons soon appeared. Many theorized that the bodies of fallen soldiers were compelled to reanimate by some mysterious force, whether because of unfinished business or out of resentment for their own slaying. The soldiers and warriors went bravely into battle and perished. They marched into battle believing that death was not an option. But still, it took them. How could they reconcile themselves to such a fate? Their souls burned with rage, and they could not accept death. Many rose up again as members of the undead. The Shinwashi forest had been seen much death in the war. That the forest could harbor zombies came as no great surprise. Nor was the sight of a zombie a rare one. The Orc country, too, had seen its fair share of zombies and roaming skeletons. The reanimated corpses were not only those of orcs. Many belonged to the humans and elf races who had perished fighting the orcs on their own soil as well. In fairy country, there were also sightings of walking corpses of humans and elves, and zombie sightings were often reported in the countries of humans and elves themselves. But there was never a single reported sighting of a zombie fairy. Fairies lived carefree lives in tune with nature and the natural order of things. They generally had no unfinished business after death. Let's keep moving. You got it, boss. And so Bash and Zell paid little mind to the appearance of the zombie they had spotted on the riverbank, and they pressed on to Elf country. The bridge that served as the border checkpoint was a new one, having been constructed only 2 years prior. In honor of it connecting the lands of the humans and the elves, it was christened Elmen Bridge. It would serve as a monument to celebrate the friendship between humans and elves in hopes of a continued alliance between the two countries. This landmark bridge was a sturdy stone construction, and it was wide enough for 2 horse-drawn carriages to pass in opposite directions. With trade booming between the elves and humans, at least once an hour the bridge was used by traders, either coming or going in their horse-drawn carts. Once every single hour. Yes, once an hour is very often in the grand scheme of things. Isn't very often. But with the current economy still struggling after the war, business was comparatively flourishing between these two lands. And with the only one cart expected per hour, the border was very lightly manned and only 2 elves were posted on guard duty. It makes sense that import taxes should be imposed on imported goods. But the alliance of 4 races still hadn't worked out the particulars of the bureaucratic matters like that. The war had been such a long one, and few could remember how things used to be done in the pre-war era. As a result, no one was quite sure how to best to move ahead in this new peaceful world. Naturally, in wartime, no one was ever slapped with import taxes or tariffs when importing goods to their allies. If such taxes existed, the poorer races, such as the Beastkin, would have crumbled under the expense. But they had managed thus far without taxes. Surely appropriate legislation would be drafted at some point in the future, once the situation required it. Yes, indeed, the border between the human and elf countries was very loosely controlled. What with how friendly the two nations were, and, "Hey, you, stop right there! You're an orc! That's what you are! What brings you here? What were you doing in human country? Speak!" Also, for anyone not aware, even though I don't own the novel, Novel 1, Bash, the orc, was helping the humans in the human country. Also, there was a holy knight with amazing tits that he was trying to court, but she told him no. Her name was Judith, and she wasn't interested. So he was sad because he wanted to marry her. He's questing for waifus, or just a waifu. The picture you see here is the 1,200-year-old elf woman who he wants to be his waifu at the end of this story. Where was I? Right. Back to hating orcs for no reason. Where was this? There we are. But the welcome the elves extended their close allies, the humans, didn't apply to other races. The members of the coalition of 7 races have been the enemies of the elves during the war. The old war wounds ran deep for their extreme brutality during the conflict. The elves held the deepest grudges toward the orcs and the succubi in particular. And the flames of these old prejudices were only fanned by the appearance of the dangerous rogue orcs, who sometimes crossed over from orc lands. Lawless and vicious, the rogue orcs caused trouble in every land they set foot in. Now, this sounds like profiling. Now Bash found himself on the wrong end of 2 pairs of sharp, primed arrows, knocked and drawn back against the bowstrings of the 2 guard elves. "My name is Bash. I am on a quest, in search of something." Well, I mean, we can't just admit, "Hi! I'm trying to find a wife." It's like that would be like, I feel like that's a very awkward icebreaker. Like, that just feels very awkward. Okay, right. The human General Houston told me that I may find what I seek here. I journeyed here for that reason. Bash? General Houston? The 2 guard elves glared suspiciously at Bash. They must have been quite young. Perhaps they hadn't been old enough to take part in the war while it was still going on. Perhaps they had only been conscripted after the war. Because if they had been seen active duty, they would have known Bash's name immediately and would have already been trembling in their boots. No, if they had seen active duty, they would have known Bash on sight and would have never allowed him to get close in the first place. The elves, who were seasoned veterans of war, had a knack for disguising themselves among the trees, blending in to be completely invisible to an enemy's detection. From the safety of their camouflaged position, they would question intruders, with the implication being that they could skewer the potential enemy with arrows if they put so much as a toe out of line. But these elves had not done that. That alone was proof that they were nothing but rookies. Did we get any intel like that? No, we heard nothing from the humans about any orc coming this way. Oh well, maybe it's just a random traveler then. Not an official emissary? So then, should we let him through? But we were warned not to let any rogue orcs in. What if he's one of them? He could be. We don't know. We don't know what rogue orcs look like, do we? Or how to fucking not stumble over my words. The 2 elf guards were muttering back and forth, unsure how to proceed. Bash's gentlemanly manners had caught them off guard. If he was a rogue orc, he surely would have attacked them the minute they stopped him from crossing. Either that or he would have come running across the bridge, bellowing war cries, and attacked them without any provocation at all. But Bash had done neither, which made it hard to believe that he could be one of those dangerous rogue orcs. But still, it was always possible that an orc was lying, putting on an act. It was impossible to tell. "Excuse me, fellas. Let me assure you, my boss here is no rogue orc." It was Zell who broke the silence, fluttering forward. Then swooping in gentle circles in the air in front of the 2 guards, Zell launched into an impassioned monologue. Be honored, be humbled, be awed, young Elflings, for you are in the presence of the exalted orc hero Bash. I have my own hype man! Hell yeah! The jewel of the orc army. A decorated war veteran, loved and respected by his own, and feared by countless others. He is a traveler on a noble mission. By express permission of the Orc King himself, of course. Why, if you fools really think this prime specimen is what passes for a rogue orc, then you have insulted not only him, but all of orc kind. Now kindly step aside and clear the way for the sublime, the stupendous, the superb, the supreme Bash. Finishing with a flourish, Zell snapped their tiny fingers. I guess Zell's non-binary. Good. Okay. Cool. Perilously in front of the elf guards' faces. Stupendous, superb, supreme. The two elves frowned. Zell's speech was long-winded, nonsensical, and fanatical. It was still funny, and brought to mind the droning monologues of elf elders, who never missed an opportunity to blather on about past days. Do you know the guy? Of course I don't know him. I don't know any famous orcs. This fairy's probably lying. Well, that's rude. This fairy's probably lying anyway. It does sound kind of suspicious. Right? Totally suspicious. Plus, everyone knows you can't trust fairies. Oh, come the fuck on! The elves have a say. What the fuck is this? A fairy's guidance is a fool's dance. Okay. Once there was a young elf Are we going into a fucking fairy tale now? In the midst of his journey, he realized his canteen had a hole in the bottom. He quickly stopped up the hole, but the water had already leaked out. He was soon parched with thirst and delirious with dehydration. He blundered in the forest in search of water. Then a fairy appeared and spoke to him. This way, good man. Fresh water over here, and plenty of it. Slake your thirst. It's clean and sweet and good. The elf traveler believed the fairy and followed excitedly in its path. It was just as the fairy promised. There was a clean pond in the clearing. The elf traveler plunged in the water with delight, but immediately he began to scream. It was a field of piranhas. In his haste, he failed to notice the steam rising from the water's surface. It was not cool, fresh pond at all, but a bubbling hot spring. Well, it still shouldn't have been hot enough to burn him to death, but still, it's kind of unfair to judge all fairies based on this. The fairy hovered above the elf, gazed down his scalded, incredulous red face, and laughed and laughed and laughed. Fairies have a habit of telling lies, of omission, and twisting the facts to mislead people for their own amusement. This elf fable serves to warn of exactly that. But the saying and the telling of the fable had only recently come into widespread use. During the war, the elves were far too busy fighting to care for fairy quirks. Then, during the fighting, the trickster nature of the fairies became apparent, as many a soldier was led right into a fairy trap. Thus, the custom of mistrusting fairies was born. Having heard the tales, the two elves made no effort to clear the path. So, you will not permit us to enter? Nope, dirty orcs like you don't get to enjoy the unfettered access to our beautiful country, you know. Now Bash was at a loss. If he had come to the elf border on his travels randomly, he would have simply shrugged off at this point and chosen no direction. But after hearing what he had heard in human country, he couldn't bear to turn away. After all, he had heard from the noble Houston, the pig slayer himself, that this was where he ought to continue his quest. Why, even now, Bash's future bride may have been awaiting him in Shinwasha Forest, a beautiful elf bride. No, Bash had his mission. He had his purpose. He could not turn back now. We need the elf. I really wanted to say a word that was very inappropriate, but I feel like that would... We are literally going to title this fucking hentai. I think we're okay to say the word pussy. I think that's okay. I think it's kind of expected at this point, given, just to be fair to the people that wrote this book, the word pussy is probably nowhere in this book, but it's everywhere in my mind. Okay, back to the story. Yeah, about a beautiful elf bride. Okay. But his mission was a personal one. Of course, he was not here for king and country, but for his own goals. He had no right to force his way through the checkpoint, but Bash had the moral high ground, surely. The elves had no right to refuse him access simply on account of him being an orc. The orcs and the elves had signed a treaty after all, and nowhere did it stipulate the elves had the right to refuse an orc access to their land. No, Bash was quite sure that he was in the right. Hey, morons, quit blocking the road. Just then, a single horse carriage came clattering and rolling this way. It was heading to the elf border and had clearly come from human country. The carriage creaked to a stop right behind Bash, and the man in the driver's seat glared down at them. It was he who had just bellowed. The man had long, silky, golden hair and pointy ears. He was an elf himself. Judging by the uniform, which was similar to the border guards, he was a member of the Elven Defense Force, or EDF, or Earth Defense Force. You know, the thing where you fight giant spiders and ants with machine guns? I mean, I still find it a little annoying that I tried to play EDF 5 and it just wouldn't work. And I played a little EDF 4. It's just they changed the way the missile launchers worked, and I feel like it kind of ruins the fun. Whereas I remember playing EDF 3, Earth Defense Force 2017 on the Xbox 360, and that was a lot of fun, and it was awesome. But that's not available on Steam. And like I said, 5 doesn't work, and 4, they changed a lot of the mechanics, and I'm like, it ruins the fun. My bad. I asked for permission to enter the country, but I am being denied. Huh. Hey, you're an orc. On the one hand, I'm glad you're not judging me. On the other hand, you are not very, perceptive. The driver peered down at Bash, his brow furrowed with puzzlement. Then he lifted his head, eyes narrowing, focusing on the two guards. It looked as though he's come from the conclusion that it would be better to speak to his compatriots about the issue rather than converse with this unknown orc. What's going on? Explain yourselves. Yes, sir. It appeared as though the driver of the carriage outranked the two guards. They snapped quickly to attention and began explaining the situation. An orc jumped out of nowhere and demanded access to the Elfland, claiming he was in search of something, and he had a highly suspicious fairy with him. He was claiming to be a simple traveler, not a rogue orc, but his story reeked of subterfuge, and so the two guards had decided to deny him access, just to be on the safe side. You there, orc, is this all true? It is true that I am no rogue orc. Do you swear to it? I swear, on the name of the mighty Orc King, Nemesis. The driver gasped. He knew what it meant for an orc to swear on the Orc King's name. I don't. Only the greatest of warriors, a great warlord or chieftain, could swear upon the king's name, and if he was found to be lying, it would be considered treason, punishable by death. Oh, so that we basically pulled rank. Yay! In other words, the orc standing before him now must be a person of great importance in orcish society. If he was traveling outside his own country's borders, that must mean he was doing so under the express orders of the Orc King himself. But that raised another question. What was the exalted orc emissary doing here? Hey! We have a picture! It appears that it's another carriage, and it has the sexy elf woman. She's also makes a different face in this one too. I'm just saying, I think Thunder Sonia would make an excellent elf wife. I mean, she is very pretty. But then again, I made a video already talking about that. It's in the I Bought Something playlist. Okay, let's go back to actually reading a story. This story is very long. I probably won't read the whole thing. Otherwise, we'll be here for until I have to go back to work. And, I kind of should sleep and stuff. He said he was in search of something. What could it be? Without finding that out first, there was no way that they could permit the orc free passage to elf territory. Oh, just let him in. What's the big deal anyway? But it was not the driver who spoke the words. No, the voice came from inside the carriage itself. It was a woman's voice. The war's over, isn't it? And the orcs have sworn an oath. Same as the rest of us. Yes, yes. There are always a few rogue orcs around. But this one says he's got the blessing of the Orc King. So he's just like another traveler, isn't he? There's no need to be such bullies, interrogating him like that. Bash's heart skipped a beat. The stranger's assistance was unexpected. The sweet sound of lovely feminine elf voices had always charmed the orcs, and Bash was no exception. But Lady Sonia, I've never heard of an orc traveling alone. It's been 3 years since the war ended. Even orcs have the right to sightsee when the mood strikes them, and if Nemesis himself has sanctioned it, then he can't be one of those rogue orcs, can he? But he has no official documents. Can we really trust his word? Excuse me? You think orcs are in the habit of just bandying around the name of their king? You do realize what it means for an orc to swear on the name of Nemesis, don't you? Of course I do, Lady Sonia. Only there are many rogue outcast orcs who spit on the name of the Orc King. He might be making the whole thing up to suit his own nefarious objectives. Yes, but use your brain. If an orc really wanted to enter lands for nefarious purposes, he'd enter sneakily by crossing the unmet river. I totally wasn't going to do that just for convenience sake. That's how all the other rogue orcs have tried at sea, but this one came right up to the checkpoint and politely asked to come in. Said he's got the blessing of the Orc King himself, and he mentioned General Houston. You do know General Houston, don't you, old pig slayer? If he was planning to sweet-talk his way in, he'd have name-dropped someone much more impressive than that. But I feel like we're talking down about the guy who was nice to me. I see. Well, if you insist, Lady Sonia, then you too, open the gates. The driver barked imperiously at the two elf guards, who quickly put their bows and arrows and swept the gates open with a flourish, gesturing for them all to pass through. The driver sniffed before lashing the horses with the reins and urging them forward. The carriage began to roll past Bash and Zell, clattering its way across the bridge. Bash stepped aside and gave it room, looking up the window. Many thanks. He spoke only these two words in his usual gruff sort of voice, but it wasn't the driver who responded, any time. We're in age peace, after all. A face appeared in the open window, a beautiful elven face. She had a high, regal nose, slanted blue eyes, a neat chin, and pointed ears. Her face was doll-like, and her bosom was modest in size, a key characteristic of elf women. She looked to be some variety of mage. She wore a wide-brimmed hat on top of her silken golden hair, and she was clad in a dark green robe, a very elf-like look. Anyways, no worry. I'm someone of some significance myself, despite not looking like it. So we have that in common. Helping you out was the least I could do. Eck! And for some reason, as the woman laid eyes on Bash's green orcish face, she jerked in surprise. Okay. Ultimately, this caused the top of her head to make contact with the window frame. There was a mighty thunk, and a beautiful elven woman fell backward into the carriage, emitting a frog-like croak as she disappeared from sight. There came another, more muted thud a second later, presumably the sound of her body hitting the carriage floor. But just at that moment, the wheels began rattling over some loose pebbles, and the clattering filled the air, leaving the driver oblivious to the plight of this passenger. The woman had clearly passed out cold on the carriage floor, but no one else seemed to have noticed. Bash probably would have noticed if he was in the right state of mind. But his head was deep in the clouds. How beautiful! It had been so long since he had laid eyes on a female elf, and never could he remember seeing one as beautiful as she. She was very embodiment of elven female perfection, and Bash was smitten at first sight. Elf women, in truth, were very beautiful indeed. Until very recently, the elf race had been the enemy, and Bash hadn't been looking at the female warrior elves in that way. But now, with post-war clarity, Bash had to admit that the elven female features were exactly his type. Their toned bodies and dainty demeanors set them apart from the humans, who trended toward curvier builds, even among the most beautiful examples of that race. Yes, elf women were stunning, sharp, and poised, like the finest steel blades. Bash was partial to the human softness too, of course, but in terms of pure visual beauty, he'd go for an elf every time. Houston had been right on the money after all. Bash's ideal bride was here, in elf country, no doubt about it. Boss, I think I've seen that elf somewhere before. Zell arched an eyebrow, but Bash merely blinked, his attention elsewhere. He was in fact already hurrying toward town. He wanted to get cozy with a willing elf woman as soon as he possibly could. Wow, we're like maybe a tenth through the story. There's like, how far was that? Okay, what page? Okay, so that's... Okay, that was... Okay, Okay, so we ended on page 21 out of... 186. So we are not going to sit here and read until the time I have to go back to work. I need sleep. So, but it's a great story. If you guys would like to hear more of it, let me know. Bye.